Imagine a friend asks you to spot them for a $29 dinner. You agree, but when they hand you the receipt, the total is actually $87, and while there are charges for things you never even ordered, you would probably ask for an itemized breakdown.
Oh, you definitely want to see the receipts for that one.
Right, and that's exactly what we are looking at today. Welcome to the Clara Horatio Daily World Brief, available at clarahoratio.com. It's June 25, 2026, and our mission is to look at the civic stakes and the human impacts shaping your world. So, in Washington today, the White House sent an urgent request to Congress for $87.6 billion to fund the U.S. war with Iran.
But the Pentagon is estimating the war has only cost about $29 billion so far. So that massive gap is triggering a sudden and really intense political pushback on Capitol Hill.
Which is happening at a terrible time because the U.S. and Iran are currently operating under a 60-day memorandum of understanding to halt the fighting.
Exactly. It's a very fragile ceasefire. And the political machinations behind the scenes over this funding request are actively threatening to unravel that exact diplomatic agreement. We're watching a domestic budget fight jeopardize international diplomacy.
Let's look closer at that $87.6 billion receipt, though. The bulk of it, $67 billion, is earmarked for the Department of Defense. But then, you read further down the sources and you see $11 billion allocated for U.S. farmers.
And another $1.4 billion to tackle the Ebola outbreak in Central Africa.
Yes, which raises a really big question. If the primary goal is funding military operations in the Middle East, how do agricultural subsidies and public health funds end up attached to a war request?
Well, you're looking at a classic legislative vehicle. In Washington, when lawmakers have a piece of must-pass legislation like emergency funding for troops in an active theater, they attach totally unrelated priorities to it.
Because they know opposing politicians can't easily vote down funding for soldiers.
Right, so the attached agricultural or health funding just slides through without a separate, risky vote. But we really should separate those political add-ons from the core military request, which is grounded in a severe logistical reality. The Pentagon urgently needs to rebuild its munitions stocks.
Because during the most intense weeks of the conflict with Iran, the U.S. expended a massive amount of highly advanced, incredibly expensive ordnance.
Yes. And restocking those precise weapons is not a matter of simply placing an order. It takes years of procurement, specialized supply chains, and, well, billions of dollars to replace what was fired in a matter of days.
And the politics of this funding are also tangling up U.S.-Israel relations in a very public way. We are seeing escalating friction between Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over Israel's ongoing military operations in Lebanon.
Which led to J.D. Vance publicly scolding Israel's leaders right from the White House briefing room.
Right, he pointed out a stark reality, noting that U.S. taxpayers fund roughly two-thirds of the defensive weapons protecting Israel. Seeing an American administration use taxpayer leverage to publicly reprimand Israel like that is historically very unusual.
Well, the subtext driving that reprimand is the current administration's fear that Israel's actions in Lebanon are actively sabotaging the wider, fragile peace agreement with Iran. Iranian leaders have explicitly threatened that if the bombing in Lebanon continues, they will walk away from the nuclear negotiations entirely.
And more crucially for the global economy, they threatened to once again close the Strait of Hormuz, which translates immediately to household impacts for you, the listener.
Because when the Strait of Hormuz reopened under this recent ceasefire, global Brent crude dropped to $73.23 a barrel.
And here in the U.S., gas fell to roughly $3.93 a gallon. It's a direct, visible line from geopolitical posturing in the Middle East to the cost of filling up your car for a commute.
The administration knows how vital that price drop is politically. President Trump is currently investigating oil companies like Shell and ExxonMobil for price gouging, arguing that pump prices just haven't fallen as rapidly as crude oil prices.
Which makes sense, because whether there's actual gouging or simply the standard economic lag in refining and distribution costs, the White House needs the public to feel the economic relief of this ceasefire immediately.
They absolutely cannot afford to let the conflict in Lebanon spark another closure of the strait, which would just send inflation surging again.
So while Washington uses military funding as diplomatic leverage, Europe is aggressively moving to secure its own defense supply chains. The German government is attempting to buy a 40% stake in KNDS, which is the European tank maker that produces the Leopard 2.
France already owns 50% of the company, and they are expected to reduce their share to 40%. So both governments sit on equal footing, potentially paving the way for an eventual IPO.
This represents a profound shift in European industrial policy. For decades, Germany hesitated to take direct state ownership stakes in private defense companies.
But the reality of a sustained war on the European continent changed their calculus. Berlin wants strategic control over a manufacturing sector that is now viewed as vital to European survival. They want to ensure they aren't completely dependent on private equity investors or unpredictable foreign powers for the production of their heavy armor.
I have to challenge the logic of that strategy, though. Does state ownership actually make defense production more efficient? State-run industries are rarely known for rapid innovation. This feels less like a streamlining of supply chains and more like a political flex by Berlin to assert parity with France.
You are identifying the exact tension at the heart of European defense sovereignty. The goal is to stabilize the supply chain, but the risk is introducing massive bureaucratic infighting. We saw the long-planned Franco-German fighter jet project repeatedly stall out.
Because the German and French aerospace firms and their governments couldn't agree on who controlled the intellectual property.
Exactly. So this KNDS deal is a massive test to see if state involvement can actually scale up tank production, or if it will just lead to paralyzed boardrooms where French and German officials veto each other.
That desire for strategic independence isn't just happening in Berlin either. The UK is undergoing a major political shift. Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced he's stepping down after 2 years.
With Andy Burnham coming in as the new prime minister. And his agenda suggests a significant reset of relations with the European Union.
Right. Burnham is framing Brexit not just as a set of technical trade obstacles to be smoothed over, but as an ongoing geopolitical vulnerability that Britain has to manage actively if it wants to remain a key player in the coalition supporting Ukraine.
And speaking of staying informed on these shifts, for more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, you can always visit clarineratio.com.
Now, let's turn from heavy armor and national borders to a different kind of arms race. We are seeing the technology Cold War escalate with a major accusation. Anthropic, the U.S. artificial intelligence giant, is accusing the Chinese firm Alibaba of carrying out 29 million distillation attacks.
Using fraudulent accounts to illicitly extract the capabilities of their Claude AI model? Yes.
I want to make sure we understand the mechanism here. What exactly is a distillation attack?
It is a method of corporate espionage unique to artificial intelligence. Training a frontier AI model like Claude requires billions of dollars in specialized hardware and years of research and development. A distillation attack bypasses all of that.
By using the highly advanced target AI to generate millions of complex outputs.
Right.
And then they feed those outputs into their own weaker AI model to train it.
They are essentially forcing the American model to act as a free tutor for the Chinese model, extracting the reasoning capabilities without paying the development cost. Anthropic is framing this as a direct threat to U.S. dominance, noting these capabilities are being repackaged on an industrial scale by geopolitical competitors.
The financial stakes attached to that dominance are astronomical. Anthropic is currently valued at $965 billion ahead of a potential IPO, while OpenAI is sitting at $852 billion. But I'm looking at the sources here, and there's a massive ethical divergence in how these two companies operate.
There really is. Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei has drawn a hard line, refusing to allow Claude to be used for mass surveillance or autonomous weapons.
And in response, the Pentagon labeled Anthropic a supply chain security risk. How does a company secure a $1 trillion valuation when the U.S. military considers its ethical boundaries a security threat?
It raises a vital question about the future of the tech industry. The Pentagon's label supply chain security risk is typically reserved for hostile foreign entities, not domestic companies prioritizing civil liberties. Meanwhile, OpenAI is actively integrating its systems with the Department of Defense.
So we are seeing a real split. Can you be a dominant trillion-dollar tech company in the 2020s without becoming a functional arm of the military-industrial complex? Amodei is betting that enterprise clients and the public will value an AI system that is firewalled off from autonomous warfare.
This software race is also colliding violently with physical limitations, though. It takes hard infrastructure to run these models. Amazon just announced a $48 billion investment in Indian AI data centers.
And IBM has revealed a breakthrough nanostack sub-1 nanometer chip. To understand the engineering here, imagine a city. Instead of building urban sprawl with transistors laid out flat next to each other, IBM is building 100-story skyscrapers of microscopic transistors.
It's a staggering leap in processing density, but just like a physical skyscraper, it introduces a severe limitation: heat.
Right, when you stack transistors vertically, The thermal energy generated by the lower levels has nowhere to dissipate. It gets trapped inside the architecture.
So if the semiconductor industry cannot figure out how to manage the thermal dynamics of these 3D stacked chips, the hardware will literally melt itself before it can power the next generation of artificial intelligence.
We are seeing physical realities force policy changes all over the world, actually. Look at India, where the foreign ministry recently declared that an Indian passport is merely a travel document, not conclusive proof of citizenship. That sounds like a bureaucratic technicality, but it has sparked a massive public uproar.
Because the civic stakes are incredibly high right now, India is currently undergoing a highly controversial revision of its electoral rolls. The government is demanding stringent documentation to prove citizenship and, by extension, the right to vote.
So when the foreign ministry abruptly declares that the most internationally recognized document a person can hold, a passport, does not prove citizenship, it provokes deep anxieties.
Minority populations in particular are terrified about what documentation actually guarantees their rights, and whether this is a quiet administrative tool to strip them of their voting power.
India is also grappling with a quiet, devastating demographic shift. In the southern state of Kerala, the mass migration of younger generations seeking better economic opportunities abroad has left the elderly population completely isolated.
The state government actually had to create a new welfare department focused specifically on aging in place. They are trying to build volunteer community networks so older citizens do not grow old and die alone in empty houses.
It is a profound failure of the modern economic model. You have a younger generation forced to leave to survive financially, breaking the traditional family support structures.
And if we connect that generational frustration to a different crisis, look at Kenya. 2 years after the deadly 2024 Gen Z anti-tax protests, heavily armed police have sealed off central Nairobi to prevent memorial marches.
President William Ruto established a $15 million compensation fund for the families of victims, but human rights groups have widely rejected it.
They refused the money because the fund lacks any transparency or mechanism for holding the police commanders who ordered the violence accountable. It is seen as hush money rather than justice.
There's a global pattern in your sources today. Voters are deeply frustrated with legacy systems that seem entirely unresponsive to their daily realities. We see it manifesting structurally in Australia. 2 independent members of parliament, known as Teal Independents, have launched a new centrist party called Community Strong Australia.
For context, Teal refers to a political movement in Australia that blends conservative, blue-leaning economic policies with green-leaning environmental action.
They are explicitly rejecting the hyper-partisan division of the traditional two-party system, arguing the legacy parties are too busy fighting to actually solve the housing crisis or address climate change.
The underlying theme across all these stories, from the isolated elderly in Kerala to the young Kenyans facing armed police to the frustrated Australian voters, is a breakdown of the social contract. The traditional structures of state support and political representation are simply failing to protect the populations they were built to serve.
And that failure of state support brings us back to the U.S., where the administration has eliminated 100,000 federal science agency jobs and slashed $1.6 billion from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA.
In response, fired government workers and scientists have crowdfunded a website, climate.us, to preserve vital public data about heat waves and storms.
I look at this and wonder, can a crowd-funded website actually replace the sheer infrastructural weight of a government agency? A few thousand small donations cannot launch and maintain a weather satellite network.
No, they cannot. It is a desperate measure by dedicated civil servants who recognize that unbiased climate data is essential public infrastructure, just as critical as a bridge or an electrical grid.
When a government abandons its role in tracking environmental threats, the vulnerability of the population increases instantly. Furthermore, this policy choice triggers a massive brain drain.
Exactly. If you are a young, talented climate scientist, you aren't going to stay in the United States to run a crowdfunded blog. You are going to migrate to the European Union or China, where the state is heavily funding research and development.
And the consequences of ignoring those environmental threats are not abstract. Extreme heat waves are currently buckling physical infrastructure across Europe. Germany's national railway, Deutsche Bahn, is telling people not to travel and offering refunds because train air conditioning units are failing, and the steel tracks are at risk of warping or catching fire.
In the UK, the government is holding official-level COBRA meetings, which is their top-level crisis response committee, just to manage the cascading failures caused by the heat.
We must contrast the fragility of Europe's rail network with the resilient strategies we see elsewhere. Look at Venezuela, where two massive earthquakes, a 7.2 and a 7.5 magnitude, struck back-to-back, killing at least 164 people.
It is a devastating tragedy that highlights the necessity of proactive infrastructure. Countries like Japan, Chile, Mexico, and Canada have learned to live with extreme seismic activity through strict building codes, seismic isolation engineering that allows buildings to sway rather than snap, and deeply integrated community support hubs.
Resilience isn't about hoping a disaster misses you. It is about building systems that protect human life before the crisis arrives. We see that proactive defense in India as well, which just rolled out the Air Sous Vide Agent 2.0 portal for mandatory Ebola screening at all airports.
It is a necessary public health defense mechanism in a deeply interconnected world.
Navigating these heavy geopolitical realities can be overwhelming, which is why having cultural context is so vital. If you check Claire and Ratio today, they're highlighting the 50th anniversary of Elaine May's film, Mikey and Nicky.
It is a fascinating look at how May was marginalized by the studio system and labeled difficult for exhibiting the exact same uncompromising perfectionism that male directors of her era were praised as geniuses for.
It's a long overdue reappraisal of her art. And if you were looking for a lighter debate on the site, there is a fierce discussion over the definitive ranking of John Cusack films, with Being John Malkovich currently holding the top spot.
Also, a very timely culinary note for anyone dealing with the European heatwave. If you have summer stone fruits like apricots and peaches, blend them into an icy granita. It requires absolutely zero time over a hot stove, which is exactly the kind of adaptation you need when the weather is this extreme.
A perfect way to endure a buckling public transit system.
Which leaves us with a final thought to consider from today's sources. We are watching a simultaneous global race to build 100-story microscopic AI chips and billion-dollar nationalized tank factories.
Yet at the exact same time, we are increasingly relying on crowd-funded websites to track deadly weather and asking volunteer neighbors to care for isolated elderly citizens.
As states pour unimaginable wealth into fortifying their algorithms and their borders, we have to ask, are they completely neglecting the fundamental resilience of the human beings living inside them?
It is a question you have to hold on to. If someone asked you to cover an $87 billion bill, you need to know exactly what you are paying for and what vital things are being left off the ledger entirely. Thank you for joining the conversation today. We invite you to visit claireandhoratio.com for more daily world briefs, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks.